Well, I appreciate the honor you're giving me today, and I welcome the opportunity to share some views on the challenges facing NATO and on defense issues more specifically for Canada. Évidemment, c'est une situation qui s'applique à tous les Canadiens. Et l'OTAN a toujours été un instrument d'unification au Canada, appuyé à travers le pays, dans nos 10 provinces et nos 3 territoires, par tous nos citoyens, parce que tout le monde savait qu'il s'agissait d'un instrument vital pour l'épanouissement du Canada au niveau international. Predictions about the demise of NATO seem to sprout every spring, like the tulips gifted to Canada by the Netherlands following the liberation of Holland by Canadian troops in 1945. And I see there are a number of Canadian troops with us tonight, and I welcome them, and I salute your bravery and your service to Canada. That metaphor is vivid in many ways because it demonstrates poignantly the power and continuing relevance of the transatlantic bridge and the significant role played by Canada and, of course, the United States in evicting the Nazi menace from Europe during World War II. NATO was designed primarily to maintain stability in Europe following that war. The fact that the next NATO summit will be held in Warsaw in July dramatically illustrates the change in the institution since it began 67 years ago. It puts in sharp relief the most immediate challenge facing the organization. In my view, there should be no difficulty at all answering the question, does NATO have a future, at that summit, nor about what Canada's role in NATO should be. Efforts to engage Russia as a security partner in Europe were dashed in the sands of the Crimea and the South, and the primary challenge now is to thwart further expansion by Russia and to ensure that those NATO members that border Russia, especially Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, remain secure and firmly under NATO's wing. President Putin clearly wants to restore Russia's great power status by forging, by force if necessary, a new Eurasian Union dependent on Russia for its economy and security, adapting Lenin's phrase of pushing the knife until it hits the NATO bone, and sharpening that knife with a 40% increase in military spending since 2013, far and above anything committed by the West. Hostilities have broken out again in eastern Ukraine, and the Minsk Accord lies in tatters. Besides flexing its military muscle persistently in Syria to prop up President Assad, Russia is now sending warplanes and naval ships to patrol the seas around the Baltic states and elsewhere. NATO is scrambling to counter the threat by stationing forces in the Baltic nations. 4 battalions of 1,000 troops in each, 2 from the US, 1 from Britain, 1 from Germany. Canada is being invited to contribute to this exercise in some way, and in my view, we should respond positively. NATO is also deploying an ABM system to Romania and eventually to Poland as well. The mood is decidedly brittle. There is no way of knowing whether any of this will serve to check Mr. Putin's ambitions or exacerbate tensions further, but that will be at the core of deliberations when the NATO leaders, including Prime Minister Trudeau, meet in Warsaw in July. Putin is relying on divisions within the alliance, and most notably on what he perceives as waning US resolve. What he sees going on south, you see it as well. Syria is a case in point. Unquestionably, Putin's tactics and his commitments in support of Bashar al-Assad have been much more effective than the sporadic, inconclusive response of the US-led coalition. When the President of the United States says, I am drawing a red line in the sand beyond which I will not tolerate any excursions, and then he does, you have just weakened the perception of the strength of that great military power, our neighbor, and the alliance that it leads. The real test will come at the end of this month, when the economic sanctions on Russia for the illegal seizure of Crimea and parts of the eastern Ukraine are due to expire. Some European allies are more keen to sustain these sanctions than others. Nothing speaks more powerfully to the value of NATO than the indisputable fact that it has preserved peace in Europe for more than 6 decades since the end of World War II. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of Eastern and Central Europe in the early 1990s brought the fundamental purpose of NATO into question. Some even suggested that it was time for NATO to call it a day. But suspicions lingered, particularly among former Warsaw Pact members who never trusted the Soviet Union again, of course, and wondered whether the Soviet Union had indeed been permanently dismantled. The focus of NATO shifted to expanded membership and out-of-theater operations in Afghanistan and Libya. Expanding the membership of NATO to include many countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact has been commendable in and of itself, but it has also proved to be a distraction at important times, drawing the focus of NATO more to membership than mission, and making the consensus decision-making structure even more challenging. To paraphrase Churchill, NATO may be the worst kind of military alliance, except for all the others. Consider the alternatives. Efforts to develop a European security and defense policy have been persistently stymied by disagreements among its members. Coalitions of the willing have had spotty success in dealing with global conflict. They have the same problems as NATO in terms of uneven burden sharing, but few of the advantages, notably legitimacy, except when authorized by the United Nations, as was the case when Derek Burney and I went down to Walker's Point and said in 1991 to President Bush, Canada will support this initiative in the Gulf War, provided you go to the Security Council and get approval. If you don't get approval, George, we're not going to support you. We want United Nations validation of this effort, and he went to the Security Council, and he got it. And that is one of the reasons why that initiative in 1990 and 1991 was so successful, both for the United States of America and for all of its allies. Even more ominous is Donald Trump's declaration that NATO is obsolete and that the U.S. is no longer capable of carrying an unequal share of the alliance's expense to preserve peace in Europe. This, too, is a frequent American lament. America is wary and frustrated in its role as the leader of the free world. Donald Trump simply put in neon lights what many Americans are thinking. The U.S. is carrying a vastly disproportionate share of Western defense, notably in NATO. Other members, including Canada, are not doing nearly enough. Even President Obama has complained openly about European free riders on Libya. NATO à la carte is not an option, but nor is it an option for America to lead from behind. This is the twin dilemma facing NATO today: inadequate commitments from Europe and Canada, and an increasingly reluctant alliance leader. Only 4 of NATO's European members, Britain, Estonia, France, and Greece, come even close to meeting the 2006 commitment to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, and only 5 have met the other commitments to spend 20% on modern equipment. Canada is woefully behind in both. Mr. Trump has, of course, said some worrisome things during his run for the Republican nomination, but his musings about NATO should not be dismissed lightly. Without persistent and tangible United States leadership, the alliance will wither and die. NATO's ability to adapt to profound changes in post-Cold War Europe and to counter the spreading of extremist Islamic terror will, I suspect, determine whether it will continue as a vital security shield. The horrid massacre of such innocent souls in Orlando underscores what has become the most pernicious threat to global security. I suspect as well that America's attention will inevitably shift more to Asia and the long-term threat to China. Václav Havel highlighted the importance of the values shared by NATO allies: freedom, democracy, and the market economy that underpin the common cultural civilization heritage of North America and Europe. And he did so because while we were born into it and we've enjoyed them forever, the United States, the same thing. This was not the case with the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and their leadership values those credentials which are being guaranteed by NATO. And so they have a visceral commitment to it, whereas we, as favored people, tend to take things for granted, and they're not for granted. We need to remember Albert Einstein's observation: the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. That is the continuing raison d'être for NATO. It is also why I firmly believe that the values that unite us in NATO remain vivid and merit constant nurturing. But Canada cannot just be a spectator. That would not be consistent with our proud history in safeguarding freedom and liberty in Europe. We should never forget, nor should we ever let anybody else forget, the substantial sacrifice that Canadians made to ensure victory in World War II, the largest combined national effort in our history. From a population of just 11 million people, 1 million of our citizens, mostly volunteers, served in uniform, and 2 years before America joined the fight. Canada fielded, with a country like this, with 11 million people at the time, the 4th largest air force and the 5th largest naval fleet in the world. Canadian servicemen and women from all parts of Canada and from all walks of life served with distinction. Their valor and their sacrifices paid dividends, huge dividends, in the Battle of Britain, the Atlantic convoys, the invasion of Italy, the D-Day landings in Normandy, and in the liberation of France and Belgium and Holland. Canadians from British Columbia to the Nova Scotia coal mines fought the noblest call, responded to the noblest call of all, from Winston Churchill: freedom. Freedom. Thousands upon thousands and up to millions of our citizens made a contribution, on our steadfast commitment to NATO since day one gives us an impressive credential, a calling card of sorts, to offer strong views on NATO's future. The cemeteries in Europe should leave no doubt on that point. Despite this major sacrifice and action in Korea, Canadians today have a somewhat mythical obsession with the notion of peacekeeping and to the noble values enshrined in the United Nations Charter, as if that were the exclusive answer to security concerns. During my tenure as Prime Minister, Canadian military forces participated in every single one of the 16